So in the last module, we looked at the early cultures of Mesopotamia, especially in Sumer. Now we're going to look at some of the later cultures, including some that are outside of the geographical range of Mesopotamia. Let's start with one of those cultures located in modern Turkey or ancient Anatolia. The dominant culture in the eastern Mediterranean and into Mesopotamia from around 1600 to 1300 BCE were the Hittites, who were from central Anatolia. Their capital was a place called Hattusha. They had a big city there with an elaborate gateway. We'll look at an example of that in a second. The other thing that's worth noting about the Hittites is that they were heavily involved with political and military relationships with other groups in the Mediterranean, including the island of Cyprus and ancient Egypt. Hittites were excellent metal workers and may have been the first group to work with iron. On this map, you can see the main Hittite empire in olive green, with spheres of influence in other colors. The Hittites were very active at this time, and they had a long and powerful reach. If you've ever heard of the Battle of Kadesh, it was fought between the Egyptians under Ramses II and the Hittites in Syro-Palestine, specifically in modern Syria. Here's just a plan of their capital city at Hattusha. We don't need to worry about it too much, but I'm only showing it to you so you can get a sense of the size of the city. It was extremely large and enclosed in heavy stone walls. The gateways into the city were large rooms in the wall, with one doorway facing out and one doorway facing into the city. Each doorway consisted of an arch-shaped stone carved of a single piece of stone, decorated on both sides with lions in relief emerging from the stone. You can see here a set of those lions. In the background, you can see the backside of the opposing gateway, with lions facing inward towards the city. While looking at this image, notice even the size of the stones to make the wall. These are absolutely huge pieces of stone. The size of the stone to make the walls at Hattusha are actually quite large, and when we compare it to something like Jericho that we looked at in the last section, you can understand that the Hittites required a much greater organization and administration in order to make walls like this. Here's another view of the Lion Gateway and also the buildings inside the city, at least the lower levels of the foundation, so you can see the outlines of some of the shapes of the buildings within the walls. And something to note about these lions, and this is fairly consistent, there's a lot of Anatolian art and Hittite art that's like this. The lions are kind of emerging. They're relief sculptures of lions, and it's kind of unusual. What's unusual about them is that it's relief sculpture that you're seeing from the front. You're not seeing it from the side. So you see the two front legs of the lion and then kind of the front part of the lion. This is unusual. This is a very particular thing that the Hittites do. And another thing I would note about this sculpture, and I'll just go back to one of these last slides where we might see it a little bit better, is just how stylized they are. That's fairly simplified. If you look at the faces and you look at the chest of the lions, everything has been reduced almost to fairly simple geometric forms. So yeah, again, these lions are fairly simplified and smoothed over. They lack much detail, but they're quite impressive and honestly quite large. They face the approaching visitor and serve as kind of a symbolic protection for the city. This mentality of protecting the weak spots of a city wall is something that we'll see again and again in this class. So our next stop is the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were a group from northern Mesopotamia who managed to conquer and control much of the region of the ancient Near East from about 1400 BCE to around 700 BCE, so quite a big span of time. They lasted a very long time, sometimes large and strong, sometimes a little bit weaker and pulling back some. On this map, I'm showing something of the Assyrian expansion along with spots of some of their important palaces. So inside that deep pink area, that's kind of the central core of the Assyrian Empire. And then the orange area are various spots of their kind of range of influence. And you can see that spreads quite a bit, almost up into Anatolia, certainly down into Syro-Palestine, excuse me, and deep into Mesopotamia as well. So they're not quite as active in Sumer, so they don't quite make it down to the Persian Gulf. So they were active in the north, especially in the mountains, and in the mountains they have better access to stone. And I mention this because we see a lot of stone monuments from the Assyrian Empire. and especially a lot of the monuments that we're going to be looking at in this class come within that blue box that I've outlined there. So those are deep in those mountains. If you remember that northern part of Mesopotamia, there's a lot of mountains, and so that blue box is really in the central part there. The Assyrians built palaces all over the place and decorated them very richly. They were surrounded by fortified cities known as citadels. The Assyrians ruled for quite some time and were especially prominent in Mesopotamia in the early centuries of the first millennium BCE. This reconstruction shows the fortified walls surrounding the city with the palace buildings inside the city. You might even be able to make out a ziggurat. The Assyrians ruled their enormous empire with military might. Like the Hittites, we'll see that they were constantly involved in skirmishes with the Egyptians. In this case, we're looking at the citadel and palace of one of the Assyrian kings, Sargon II, at Dur-Sharrukin in modern Khorsabad. Notice the large walls that protect the palace complex. There's a lot of Assyrian palaces and a lot of Assyrian king names, and most of the palaces were built in places that have both a modern and ancient name. So it can get very confusing. Sometimes they're called by their modern name, sometimes they're called by their ancient name. I've really made this slide so that you have references to all of the names I'll be referring to in this video, though the slides will be labeled as well. I also wanted to note that we'll be paying especially close attention to the architecture and decorative and protective sculpture found in these fortified palaces. So basically you can keep this as a need to know basis in that there'll be particular pieces that we look at that will be identified with where they come from and whatnot. But overall, because it can be kind of complicated and there are a lot of complicated names, I just wanted you to be aware that there are some ancient names and some modern names, and these things kind of, different authors have different standards for whether they want to call something by their ancient name or their modern name. Just so you're kind of aware of this organization, I certainly don't expect you to memorize these names as they're listed right here. So here you can see the same reconstruction drawing we saw before where the different parts are labeled. You can see the citadel and the palace are part of the same complex, but they're separated from the larger city with their own walls and gateways. So there's like two separate walls. There's a city wall, there's a citadel wall, and then there's palace walls as well. I found this picture on the internet just to give you a sense of scale, especially this is a gateway that leads into the citadel. It is very heavily restored, but nevertheless it gives you a sense of how grand these structures were. The gateways into the citadel, like at Hattusha, were physically and symbolically the weakest part of the wall, and so required more divine protection. At Hattusha we saw lions, and here we see guardian figures who are in fact mythological because they combine body parts from a few different creatures. Let's meet them. The gateways and doorways were often guarded with protective creatures called lamassu, and that's what we're looking at here. These creatures combined the body parts of humans, birds, and bulls, and sometimes lions, which is what we see here on the left. The hat he wears looks a lot like the hat that the god wore on the Stele of Hammurabi, doesn't it? These are supernatural, protective demons. Count how many legs they have. This is so that they'd be accurate in profile view as well as when we see them from the front. It's only from this oblique angle that something looks a little bit not right. The person standing beside the lamassu in the picture on the right can give you a sense of scale. These things are large and intimidating. Think about them in comparison to the Hittite gateway we just looked at. These in some ways are more elaborate, and these are much more frequent because just about, every Assyrian palace and every Assyrian citadel had lots and lots of these examples of these lamassu. In addition to the lamassu, Assyrian palaces were covered with reliefs, mostly carved of alabaster, a locally available stone, and most of them showing the king doing kingly activities, hunting, in battle, relaxing at banquet. Here's a very old watercolor of the interior of an Assyrian palace, and although it's pretty fanciful, I think it's worth seeing how these things were arranged on the walls, and also it's important to note that much of the decoration was originally painted, even though most of that paint doesn't survive today. Here's a close-up of one of the palace reliefs. In this case, the king is on a lion hunt, and he is getting ready to kill a lion just before it seems the lion is going to jump onto his chariot. The chariot has to make its way over the corpse of a lion that the king has just killed. Oddly, behind the lion getting ready to jump on the chariot are two guys. So this is a pretty straightforward description of what is going on here. Now let's consider its context and interpretation. These two guys are clashing together what look like cymbals and are making noise to scare the lion towards the king. In other words, this scene of the bravado of the king is really kind of staged, and there was apparently no shame in that. Scenes of the king killing lions, sometimes with his bare hands, are extremely popular in Assyrian art and these Assyrian reliefs. If you are some poor slob from the sticks and you have to come and see the king, and you walk into his palace and you see pictures of him killing lions with his bare hands, you might just be a little bit intimidated, and I know I certainly would be. And P.S. I haven't been actually reading stuff off of the slides here, but the way that you pronounce this guy's name is Ashurnasirpal. And one of my professors in graduate school had a cat named Ashurnasirpal. That's a true story. Here's another relief of the king killing a lion, and this time it's a hand-to-hand combat. The king here is shown having a superhuman strength, which is exactly the message that the king wanted to communicate here. In these lion hunt scenes, the lions almost always lose the battle. Here are a couple of other details from the lion hunt at Kalu, in this case showing two dying lions. It has been noted that there is a certain nobility in these animals, both shot with several arrows, suffering greatly, and dying. The lioness in the panel on the top has been paralyzed and drags herself forward, and her mouth is open, and you can almost imagine her moaning in pain. The lion on the bottom right image drags his front paw as blood comes out of his mouth. There's something heartbreaking about these images. It's been said that the Assyrians held great respect for the lions that they killed, and that may be true, but probably the sculptors really just had a chance to observe them very close up, considering what we know about how staged these lion hunts were. In addition to hunts, there are other themes that are common in Assyrian palace reliefs, and after a hard day killing lions, apparently the king needed some relaxing time, so here he is in his garden. The king reclines while his wife sits before him. Servants stand by to bring him food and drink and to fan the king. Notice the detail of the flora and fauna here, interesting plants and animals. Also notice the detail in the furniture and the clothing. A lot of these reliefs survive, and in addition to helping us understand the logistics of royal life in Assyria, they are also excellent ways for us to reconstruct interior and exterior scenes in Assyria because of the level of detail provided. Furthermore, the iconography of these scenes are really rich. What the king does, details of his daily life, military life, etc. Look at clothing and jewelry and furniture and all kinds of things like that. And by the way, remember Ashurnasirpal, the cat, he had a brother named Assurbanipal. And so I'm serious, that was my graduate professor. Okay, so in this relief we see the other occupation of the Assyrian king, fighting in battles. In this case, you can see enemies swimming across a river, in this case it's the Euphrates, while Assyrian archers shoot arrows at them. If you look carefully, you can see that of the three swimmers here, only one of them is actually swimming. Then there are two that are clutching something in their arms. In fact, they are holding animal skins filled with air and tied up to serve as a balloon to keep the soldier afloat. Basically, we're looking at ancient floaties. This is an example of the kind of detail that these reliefs give us, a fascinating glimpse into the lives of the Assyrians. We won't talk about it here, but there's also rich representations of the king participating in religious activities with mortal and divine attendance. The Assyrian world seems to have been a lush, over-the-top place to be, especially if you were the king. It's worth noting, however, that these imperial reliefs were very much intended to send a message to anyone fortunate enough to make it into the inner rooms of the citadel, that is, the palace. If you had an audience with the king, you would be in awe of the images surrounding you, intimidated by the prowess of the king. The Assyrians were despised by everyone who was subject to them. Bottom line, the Assyrians have a reputation for just being mean. They did not treat their subjects well, and as the empire began to fall apart and their weaknesses began to show, everyone got on the bandwagon and revolted against the Assyrians, leaving the empire in ruins. What this means is that there was room for those Sumerian cities once again to rise up. At this point, the city of Babylon took the lead. After the fall of the Assyrians, the city of Babylon took over control of much of Mesopotamia, though their empire never extended nearly as widely as the Assyrians. This is the second time that the city of Babylon was especially prominent. The first time was under Hammurabi, and so this period from about 600 to 500 BCE is known as the Neo-Babylonian period. The kings in Babylon were dynastic, but the most prominent one was Nebuchadnezzar, mentioned in the Old Testament as a pretty awful guy towards the Jews. But he did completely rebuild the city of Babylon during the Neo-Babylonian period. We're looking at an artist's view of what it might have looked like in the 6th century BCE. Notice the ziggurat in the background on the right. This is the time and place, by the way, when the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon were made and became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. We're going to pick this up in the next video.